Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with New Role, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of New Role, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Malcolm Groat, current chair of AIM-listed Harland and Wolff and TomCo Energy plc, respectively a major UK shipyard operator and US energy innovator. Senior independent director at Baronsmead's Second Venture Trust, a £350 million fund focused on unquoted and AIM companies, board advisor at MMM Consulting, and trustee at the Royal Society for Public Health. An experienced chair of public companies and advisor to growth ventures, Malcolm began his career at PwC before gaining more than 25 years of experience as CFO, COO, and CEO, with a focus on companies operating in mining, energy, and construction. As a non-executive, in addition to his current chair, advisor, and SID roles, Malcolm was previously audit committee chair at Community Foods Limited and London Mining plc, giving him a broad perspective on both fiduciary and advisory boards from a range of vantage points. Malcolm, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver, for having me on.
Malcolm, I'd like to dive straight in, given your extensive experience as a chair of AIM-listed companies, to talk about what are the key challenges of being a chair of an AIM-listed company.
I think the first thing to think of is, for people that aren't familiar with AIM and how it's different, is that AIM is different. And the companies on AIM are meant to be high-growth companies. They're meant to be risk-taking. They're not the same as a FTSE type company where you're looking for stability and a little bit of a tweak. It's a really different kind of animal. And so being the chair of an AIM company, in large measure, is about risk management and risk awareness and about working with small teams. And so it's really quite a different animal from being a chair in a public entity, a large public entity.
Can you give me an example that would bring that to life?
I could probably give you several examples, but let me try and think of one good one. Right, so with Harland and Wolff, maybe I shouldn't be too specific. There's a company that's really picking itself up by its bootstraps. If you go back a few years, all of the entities we now have were bust. And so putting that together into a business that's viable and winning, as we've just done, a £1.6 billion order from the MOD, I mean, that takes a lot of work and a lot of grit from the people who've been doing it. And I wouldn't like to claim to be at the front of doing that, not at all. But it requires the board to be supportive and requires the board to be proactively helpful and not the kind of board that you can sometimes have, which is quibbly and scoring points. We've had to let some of that stuff go a little bit in order to give the company steam to move forward and to be successful. I think that's really important in AIM companies. Very different from a PLC in a large market. You have to be prepared to allow the management team to do their thing, and you have to encourage them to do their thing and give them a bit of cover while they're doing it. I think it's a really important aspect of being a non-exec in an AIM company. I suppose in this particular case, we've had to hire a lot of people quickly to build the company, to rebuild the company. You've got a bit of a chicken and egg because you haven't yet raised the money to pay for them all. But we've had to make decisions to be quite ballsy and go ahead and hire those people and know that they're going to take 6 months to come in and do the job. And so we've had to take that kind of decision, spending decisions that you might not take if you were less confident of yourselves being able to eventually win these orders. You know, if you were thinking you might want to be a bit slower at it, you would not hire at the speed that we've hired at. Okay, we've brought in some very good people that the company probably wouldn't even look to attract if it were not being ambitious.
Really interesting. And how did you evaluate that risk that you were taking?
I did quite a bit of 360 on it. I spent a lot of time with our investors, our shareholders, just to make sure that they were up for that, and that's what they wanted us to do with their money. And it very much was. And so they looked to us to manage the risk correctly. That is to say, make sure that the right things were being attended to, but not hold back the effort. They wanted us to charge forward with enthusiasm. And that was their message to me. And because it was a uniform message, I felt confident in rallying everybody to the same message. As a company, we were able to do that wholeheartedly.
Really interesting. One of my favorite books is Super Forecasting, where they talk about sort of base probabilities and adjusting from base probabilities. And one of the great examples they give is of when the whole weapons of mass destruction invasion of Iraq was launched, and people made that decision on the basis of there being a significant risk. And when they went back and interrogated people about what did they understand by significant risk, I think the percentage probabilities that people assumed ranged from something like 1% through to 50%. So it always really interested me how people think about risk? And how do you make sure people around the table are on the same page as you in the way that they're thinking about it? What's your framework for thinking about managing risks like that?
Okay, well, I think it's horses for courses for a start. Again, I think AIM companies are high risk, so everybody who's involved should be up for a bit of risk. I remember one company a long time ago, we had a very good seasoned guy as a non-exec. He had a very credible record in the city. He'd retired, and he was doing this. I think he was giving us the benefit of his experience, but he was really risk averse. I mean, really risk averse. And everything we did, he was saying, "Oh, I'm not sure about that." And it went on for a couple of years, and in the end, we had to let him go because it was just too painful. And I don't blame him in a way, because for him, he really did have zero risk. I mean, he wanted no risk for him. But I think if you're a non-exec director on an AIM company, you're doing it for the company, not for yourself. And if you've got zero risk appetite, you probably shouldn't be doing it. You should be thinking about what is the correct risk for the company, for its shareholders, and for the employees and all the participants in that company. And you should be running the company to that level of risk, not your own personal level of risk.
Got it. And maybe this is me sort of being too analytical about it, but how do you think about that risk? I mean, I suppose the way I might have thought about it would be, I don't know, it's a 1.6 billion contract. We've got a 50% chance of winning it. So on a weighted basis, it's 800 million of revenues there. If we invest 10 million upfront to get that, that's a pretty good return for the risk of zero. But what sort of discussion or framework did you use to kind of evaluate that? Like, when would it have been too great a risk for you to have taken? It probably wasn't that clear cut.
We did use those tools, actually. We used exactly the method you described. But in the end, it's done by feel. It's done by, do we feel that the MOD, in this case, customer anyway, is seriously minded to take a punt on us? Are they going to do this? Because the MOD, we perceive, would be quite conservative, and it would go back to the usual suspects rather than appoint somebody who's untried. And so our test, one we had to pass, was would they trust us to deliver? And so they were quite exacting, and we had to make sure that we could meet that. And I suppose that was our main risk reduction effort. It was to do that, to show them that we could be credibly trusted to do the job.
Really interesting. You are on an amazing range of board sectors, from energy to shipbuilding. And I was wondering, are there common characteristics across those boards that you see as unique to AIM that transcend the different sectors, or are they all very unique?
I don't think they are very unique. I've discovered, and obviously the businesses are different, but as an AIM NED, they're not that unique. There are some common themes. One is the one I've mentioned about the risk thing. An effective board on AIM really is a different animal from, for example, on a big public institution. I'm involved in a public institution which have about 15 directors, and they move forward one step at a time, and it's very correct. But on an AIM company, if you've got a board of more than 6 or 7 people, you're going to sink. Okay, that's my view. So you want to keep the board small. You want to keep it fleet of foot. You don't want to be too hidebound. I mean, you have to do the formalities, but don't get stuck on them. And you want the atmosphere to be one where everybody gets stuck in. Sleeves rolled up, say what you think, contribute an idea, be happy for someone else around the table to take it forward and bounce it on. It's not about grandstanding. It's not about showing how clever you are. It's about being part of a team that's trying to achieve something. And it's something you need to achieve today, tomorrow, the next day, not 3 months, 6 months from now. So it's a very immediate thing. And it's a hands-on thing, and it's a very honest and transparent relationship. You're dealing with people almost in the way you would down the pub. It's a bit more formal than that, but you want people to contribute their ideas in that open forum.
The way you're sort of describing there almost sounds like it's approaching a more of an executive role than a non-executive role. Would that be a fair characterization, or?
No, I don't think so, actually. I don't think it is that. It's approaching the non-executive job, but doing it in a way that is flexible and supportive as your first instinct, rather than standing back and being detached as your first instinct. I mean, of course, in the end of the day, you have to do your job. And if that requires you to be independent and difficult, that's what you have to do. But your starting point should be, I think, on AIM, that you're in it to help them win.
How do you think about evaluating your success as a chair on an annual basis? And to what extent is that different for each of your boards?
It is different in each board, actually. Some of the boards are quite formal, and we go through a proper checklist. Sometimes we even have external people in to help us with that. And that tends to be the larger companies that do that. On some of them, it's a really informal process where I know the NEDs, the other directors, all pretty well, because we've been sleeves rolled up, sorting out problems all year. And so that is a much more informal thing where you just get a feeling, really, and you talk to each other in a casual sense to find out is everybody happy. You don't need to go through a formal process sometimes.
I mean, if you were sort of designing sort of your perfect process on that spectrum, what do you think it looks like? I mean, sometimes you see people going through these incredibly detailed, extortionately expensive processes, and you feel like they end up being told all the stuff they already knew anyway. The other end of the spectrum, you get people kind of doing a light touch thing where they don't even really bother to self-reflect. What does your...
Well, I probably prefer the light touch. I'm an accountant, so I like box ticking and that kind of stuff anyway. But so I'm not against the formal approach. I probably would go a bit easy about spending a lot of company money getting someone in to tell you, to borrow your watch to tell you the time type thing. I think you should be able to work out amongst yourselves whether you're effective as a board. But going through a checklist is never a bad thing. But my gut feeling is you should be able to tell, really, whether you're effective as a chairman by the dynamics of the people you're around and whether results happen. And also whether you're effective as a non-exec by the same thing. Are you contributing? Do you feel you're contributing? Do you feel from the feedback you get from your colleagues that you're adding value? And I think people can tell, can't they? You don't need someone to tell you that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on the nature of the person. The people who can't tell don't know, and the people who can don't need to be told. How do you think about building your relationship with the CEOs? What does that look like in practice?
Well, again, my experience is mainly AIM. And I think in AIM companies, the CEO is usually the driving force. It's usually the person without whom not much is going to get done, on whom we all rely heavily. So I think the CEO is extremely important in certainly AIM companies. As the chairman, you need to have great respect for them. I actually naturally do anyway. I've always been attracted to entrepreneurial people, and I've always been attracted to people that get stuff done. And so I generally like CEOs as a type. But yeah, in relationship with them, you need to show that you have respect for them, and they need to show they have respect for you in your capacity as chairman. And I think it's important to be available to them because sometimes it's a very lonely job being a CEO, and sometimes they just need someone to lay off on occasionally, which is quite nice. And also, you don't want them to be your best mate either, because that's not going to work. So there's a balance to be struck. But I think it's really important not to be at odds with the CEO. And ultimately, if you find that that's happening, one of you needs to go for the good of the company. And it's not always the CEO that needs to go.
And so on a week-to-week basis, what does that look like in practice?
In my experience, it's mainly being available to them, but also ringing up. I ring them up once a week, once a fortnight, even if they want me to or not, to catch up with them and find out what's happening and how they feel and how they're getting on, how life is generally for them. And then meeting with them from time to time, having lunch with them one-on-one. I think those things are important. It's actually also really important to respect them in other forum. If you're visiting a site somewhere or if you're having a board meeting, you don't want to embarrass the CEO. You don't want to say anything that makes him look a turkey. It's not very kind. And it's also not very productive. It's not productive to the overall outcome. And I have been in boards where people have taken lumps out of the CEO in certain circumstances. And I just think, why would you do that? If you want to do that, do it privately. Help the guy or fire him, but don't torture him. What's the point of that?
How do you think about your role? I feel like I've seen chairs who take very much a sort of coaching role where they ask questions. I've seen chairs who take more of a mentoring role where they're leading from the front and expecting the sort of CEO to keep up. How do you think about that dynamic and that level of your sort of activism versus sort of being a passive surfing the wave versus driving the wave?
I certainly don't think it's my job to drive the wave. I'm only doing it one day a week, and if the company is dependent on me to drive the thing forward, it's all gone wrong. That should not be what's happening. And probably not even the right personalities for doing that anyway. I'm an energetic person, but I want other people to be in doing it. And I certainly want a CEO to be a CEO. I don't want a CEO to be a puppet of the chairman. I think that's a disaster.
And have you ever had CEOs where you felt like they didn't have a sort of sense of direction of where they were going? Is that then terminal for them, or?
I think it's okay if it's temporary. I mean, we all have doubts from time to time, and that's not a bad thing. But if you've got someone that simply isn't capable or hasn't got the ultimate vision, then yes, they should not be doing it.
And have you ever experienced that? Have you had a CEO where you felt that they lacked that vision?
I think I can remember one instance where we had a CEO who had kind of run out of steam. It had been very successful for a time and then went slightly wayward. And so that CEO we replaced, yeah.
Interesting. And what about the rest of the executive? How do you think about your relationship with the rest of the executive? I came across some fascinating data recently which showed that most of the executive outside of the CEO see very little value in the board. And my sort of working hypothesis of that is down to a lack of communication. How do you think about that relationship with the rest of the exec as the chair?
It's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way around, actually, Oliver. That's very interesting. Well, from my point of view, I don't want to work around the CEO and the CFO. They're the two that I have a straightforward relationship with. I can talk to them about anything. They can talk to me about anything, and it's confidential, and we work properly in that way. The other people who report to them, I like to spend time with them. I'm very happy to go and see them, have a relationship with them, but it's never going to be around the back of the CEO or the CFO. And I don't go, I might once come across a chairman who used to go around asking people what they thought of their boss. And I think that's just not a right way to carry on for me. I certainly would never do that. I'm open to them. If they've got a problem and they want to tell me, then I'm accessible. But I do not want to go digging to try and find out dirt on the CEO. That's not what I want.
And so how do you look to see through the executive narrative then? If you're sort of relying on their narrative, are there ways that you triangulate to sort of look through that and to, I suppose, quality assure yourself?
Yes. To be fair, I might be the kind of person that judges people by what I see from them. So I spend a lot of time with people, meeting people. And so I would not necessarily be triangulating all that much. I do, but I'm not relying on the triangulation. I do get feedback, of course, from the advisors and from other people who work with these key executives. But I tend to work in the end on what I see myself and what I feel about them.
Really interesting. Have you ever had a sort of disconnect between those two things where you started to see, I don't know, it could be in the data, you're starting to see employees churn or sick days going up or something like that isn't coming through in the executive narrative?
Yeah, that actually did happen. In the case where I described where someone had been very good and became slightly wayward, what happened with that individual was that he became rather full of himself, I suppose, been in the job a long time, and started to sort of mislead, I think. Probably not, well, maybe deliberately, but we were getting a slightly false impression, and there was a little bit of massaging going on, and we ended up getting the information correctly, in that case, from the finance director, and I was able to use that to remove the CEO. Yeah, that is one example of how that might work.
I want to talk a little bit about board agendas, which sort of dictate, at least in my mind, so much of the effectiveness of the board. How do you think about setting the board agenda as a chair?
Well, I'm kind of simplistic about it, really, Oliver. What I do is about a week before the board meeting, I sit down with the standard board agenda that we have as a sort of basic framework, and I'll go through in conversation with the CEO and the CFO to see if there's anything they want to change. And I'll go through anything I know that the non-execs want to change in the conversation I've had with them during the time. And then we'll come up with a draft agenda, circulate it. Anybody can add or subtract, and then we send it out, and that's the agenda. But then I'm not hidebound by it when we get to the meeting either. We'll use it as a structure, as a tool. But if the meeting sort of goes off and spends an hour on something unexpected, that's not necessarily bad.
Got it. And how much do you, there's a lovely piece by McKinsey on where forward-looking boards spend their time, and they're sort of planned out as a sort of set-piece agenda a year in advance. And then obviously you have the stuff that comes up that you sort of react to. Like, what's your mix of set-piece things that you've sort of planned a year in advance, and what do those look like versus how much of your time are you reacting on the spot?
Well, again, I think in AIM companies, you need to do a lot of reacting on the spot, but you also need to have the formal annual processes. And we've got board committees, and you have to let them do their thing. It's all correct and proper. I don't find that stuff difficult, really. I don't find, as a chairman, that there's any great difficulty in doing the cranking the handle stuff. It's really quite well laid out, and all companies follow it pretty much the same. I think it's very important to be forward-looking rather than backward-looking. Yes, you need to look at the accounts of the last month and interrogate them and ask questions and let that happen. But you don't want to spend all that much time on that. You're looking, even when you're doing that, to what you can learn for the future or what can be improved. You're not really looking to find out any dead bodies buried in there. That's no use. And so what you're looking for is the forward-looking aspect of that, really. And so the whole thrust of the meeting should be about the future. I'm very happy for it to be flexible and variable to the circumstances of the time.
Really interesting. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the nomad and the relationship, which is quite a unique phenomenon to AIM. How important is that relationship? What are the things that you've seen go wrong there, and what do you look for in your nomad?
I think the nomad relationship is really important. It's absolutely required anyway. On the AIM market, you have to do this. You have to have an AIM, a nomad, and they are there to protect the market and the investors. And there's a lot of compliance and regulatory components of that. So you have to respect them for what they do. You have to have them. And so you want people that are competent. So that's the first thing you want. And I have to say, my experience of nomads is quite extensive. Now, I must have dealt with half of the nomad firms out there over the years, and they are pretty good. I don't find I can't point at one firm and say they're rubbish and another firm say they're brilliant. I think individual nomads can be good and bad, but they're all of a high standard in terms of their competence. The thing I look for additionally is their personality. And I like people who are bright and positive rather than dull and negative. And since most of these nomads have been chartered accountants at some point, you end up with quite a high proportion who are very competent, but dull and negative by instinct, because we are trained that way. We're trained to be. And so I prefer the ones that have come up with ideas for how you can move forward and be positive. And so there are two or three I would particularly pick out as individuals I would go back to again. But on the whole, they're kind of all of the same, really.
Can you give me an example of where one of them has sort of added real differentiating value?
Yeah, I can think of an example where we were doing a corporate deal in the US. It was pretty complicated, and they came up with something they'd seen before, which was a simple, very clever solution to the deal that made it a lot less complicated, and everybody loved it, and we just hadn't all thought of it ourselves. The various parties involved hadn't thought of it. So it was very helpful, very positive, and it wasn't that the guy involved had to invent it. He drew it from his experience, but it was very helpful.
Okay, so it's that sort of market insight, being able to cross-pollinate. Interesting. And what about the investors as a sort of chair of an AIM company? And it sort of feels very topical at the moment with lots of companies talking about going across to the US. How do you think about your role vis-a-vis the investors?
Well, I think there's two things I want to say on that. I think if you're an AIM chairman, you need to be keeping in touch with your investor base. And it's actually quite difficult because a lot of that's retail. So it's not just a question of going to see half a dozen serious investment institutions. You have to do that as well, obviously. But the retail guys, having a relationship with them is quite difficult. And you have to be careful not to be overly distorted in your perception by the retail people that contact you. Okay. Some of them love to be in touch with you, and that's fine. But there's a whole army of them out there that don't. They might very well be the true opinion that you need to tap. So if you're really going to be responsive to retail opinion, you need to go and talk to a fair cross-section. And then the other aspect you were mentioning was the US. In the US, there's a lot of money, far more money for investment than we have in the UK, and particularly for speculative investment, such as AIM companies. There's far more money. I mean, gosh, it's in multiples.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm curious, you've sat on boards on both sides of the table as an exec as well as a non-exec. What was your experience of boards as an executive, and how did they add value, and how did they frustrate you?
Well, I'm particularly put in mind of being frustrated more than one occasion. I'm thinking of an example where I was the CFO, and what I found was that these meetings used to drag on, and at the end of it, I was the one with all the work to do. I remember that. And also there were people who turned up because it wasn't a very good golfing day or they weren't doing something else. They turned up to board meetings, and they would make silly points because they knew that was in the playbook for a non-exec. They would make the standard points. And, sometimes you just yawn thinking, oh, not that again, or where's the value add in that? But so those were frustrations. I think it's human nature that people do that, but it's not ideal. And in terms of value add, well, there's been some tremendous value add over the years with non-execs. When I was an exec, particularly when I was briefly a CEO, I really benefited from having the advice of non-execs who'd been there and done it and could give me the encouragement I needed to do that job. But there were also some specific, really helpful things in making deals happen, making connections for us with other parties. Again, in an AIM company, you're quite small. You're kind of isolated in your little field. You don't know everybody. And if you've got an NED who's been involved in lots of transactions and knows bankers in London and those sorts of things, or overseas, they can sometimes bring to the table people that you would never have otherwise been able to contact or even think of. And so there's big value in non-exec directors, and it's very important. A big part of being a chairman, I think, is to get that value out of your non-exec directors in a way that they're happy to contribute it. You don't want to nail them against the wall, and you just want them to feel part of it and to really want the success of the company so that they give everything they've got to it.
So I want to hear more about that in a second, but going back to the frustrations, you're filling me with fear now. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, these are probably all the questions I ask. What were the sort of the yawn questions that really used to frustrate you?
Well, I don't know. I'm trying to remember that. There were sort of the standard things of being a kind of basic level non-exec, I suppose. I don't want to be unkind about any of them, but it was too bleeding obvious, really. It was, if something wasn't right somewhere, they'd spend all day picking over it rather than just accepting, okay, there's been a mistake, move on. Let's get on with something useful rather than dwell on the easy hits. And another thing I've noticed with bad non-execs, sorry to bring this up again, is that if you're a non-exec, there aren't many levers you can pull, okay? You can fire the CEO, you can fire the CFO, you can drop out of the room. Okay, those are your weapons that you've got. They're not many. And to me, it's far too common for non-execs to go around with these weapons in their hands, thinking maybe I might use this weapon, maybe I'll walk out. And that, I think you really should get past that. You really should reach a level of maturity where you are not going to use those weapons except in absolute extremis, and that you're there to support and advise and contribute, not sit in judgment and be political and argumentative for the sake of it and show how clever you are. Because I think that's not what you're there for. You can do that somewhere else. But if you're on the board of a company, you owe it to the shareholders and to the people who work there to contribute only positive stuff.
So going on to that positive stuff, you talked about in various occasions where you as an exec have got a lot of value out of your board. Can you give me a few examples of what that was in practice?
Well, I'm trying to think back, but yes, there was a company I was involved in as the finance director that was a mining company and was involved in projects in various countries and struggling a bit, I think, to manage the complexity of what we'd taken on. It was quite a complicated portfolio. My instinct was to stick with the portfolio approach, but to rapidly move through and sell some of the projects that we'd held for a long time, try and fix them up, sell them on, but keep the portfolio approach. And then I thought that was the right model. But we brought in a non-exec who had been in the city for a long time. And he was very clear with us, you don't want to do that. You want to just focus on one, pick the winner and be that one horse company. Because the stock market, the investors out there, they want to know nice and simply that you do X, and that's what we're measuring you on. And if we want to get into Y and Z, we'll go and do that ourselves. We don't want you doing it. And so that's what we ended up doing. We ended up being a one-horse company because that's what the market wanted. But that was very helpful input because I think otherwise we would have wanted to carry on trying to do this portfolio thing ourselves. I happen to think that's not a bad way to be, but I think we would have really come up against it with the investment community.
Really interesting. So is that strategic clarity?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Do you think it's always critical to have someone with a CEO background on the board?
Personally, I don't think it works to have a person with CEO background on the board unless they've been out of it for a time. I mean, for quite a good time. Because a CEO is by nature a kind of leadership type position and a lonely position and a decision-making position, you end up with people coming to the end of their CEO lives who are actually kind of full of themselves in a good way and are expecting to be there making the decisions. They expect to have the information put in front of them and then they make the decision. And it's not the same kind of collegiate thought process that a board has. And not many CEOs, I think, readily step from CEO to NED directly. They're probably better to have a cooling off period. But certainly I would avoid a CEO ever becoming directly a non-exec chairman anywhere. I would advise CEOs not to go straight into a non-exec chair role because it's a very different beast. And it must be very tempting for CEOs to be too decisive and too involved. And you end up then with friction with the real CEO if you're not careful. And you can't do in a day a week what a CEO needs to do. So you just can't, you mustn't tread on that patch. You have to let the CEO do the CEO's job and you have to be the non-exec chairman. And it's a different job for which I think some CEOs really struggle with that transition.
Interesting. What value do you think CEOs do bring? I mean, I've certainly seen boards where I've felt the lack of a CEO, the lack of a person who's experienced that loneliness, who's experienced what it is to sit in that seat, and the rest of the board were just blind to that because none of them had held that role. In your mind, what value does someone with CEO experience bring?
It's interesting. I mean, I was a CEO myself fairly briefly, just for a few years. So I am very sensitive to that loneliness of a CEO. I'd like to think that most people on the board would have that sensitivity, but maybe you're right. Maybe if you haven't experienced it, you don't appreciate it. It's certainly very important that people should appreciate it. As I said earlier, I have a huge respect for CEOs because I know how bloody difficult it is. And not from my own experience, really from observing other people who've done very well at it. And I think that it's important to be supportive of them and give them a shoulder to cry on, if you know what I mean. I think that's important rather than setting yourself up against them and trying to show how clever you can be scoring points against them.
Okay, really interesting. I guess the other end of the spectrum, how do you think about people who've never been at the C level sitting on boards?
I can imagine that working in exceptional circumstances, definitely. I remember we nearly recruited one of our boards, a lady who was a professor somewhere in Oxford, I think it was, and a very, very bright lady. I'm sure she would have brought something to the board. In the end, we didn't go with her, went with somebody else. But the collective reason for why we didn't recruit her was because she hadn't got any experience of corporate life. There are exceptions, and she might well have been one of them. But even if you go with that and bring in someone who hasn't got that experience, you need to be, first of all, very careful about doing it. And then you need to spend a lot of time on induction, getting them to feel so they can think on the same wavelength as the rest of you. You do want a board where there's diversity of thought, but it's not going to do anybody any favors if one person is an outlier and can't fit with the rest and there's no team ethos. It's a balance to be struck, isn't it, between diversity of thought and groupthink and all that kind of stuff. But I do think you'll get more productive output, better result, if everybody can reasonably quickly get themselves into being collectively positive rather than individually negative.
What have been your sort of best and worst experiences of onboarding?
The best experiences, I would say, where you've got people who are really clever people from their own backgrounds, really distinguished people in their own backgrounds, and you somehow managed to meld them together to deal with your board problems and situations. Again, to me, it's about tapping into their want to do that, their desire to contribute. And once you've done that, it liberates them to contribute everything they can. So I think that's a really important aspect of it. I'm not opposed to bringing in people who have no knowledge of the business. I'm not opposed to that. But I think if you bring people in who are egotistical, they are the ones you want to watch. Okay. I would be very careful of people that are egotistical because they tend to, even if they don't mean to, they tend to try in the end to dominate stuff and pull it off to one side. And you can't afford to do that in small companies. You have to keep the thing running down the path at speed, and you need to be able to be pretty dexterous with the steering, as I said. And I think if you have people in there who are too big and powerful and too opinionated, in the end, they slow you down or they take you up the wrong road.
Interesting. And how do you go about weeding those people out now as a chair when you're sort of sitting there interviewing people? What are the red flags that you look for?
Well, I'm trying to think of the red flags. Well, you can usually pick it up in the course of an interview. You can normally pick it up if someone is of that kind. I remember one particular interview, we had a chap who was actually a very distinguished individual. Actually, I think he was an accountant originally. Anyway, he was an accountant who then had spent 30 years in a company, a big company, very well-respected company, worked his way to the top. And I thought, wow, everybody who's on this panel is going to prefer this guy over the other character. The other character was much more gritty and had been around the places, up and down holes. And I thought, I prefer the gritty guy, but I know they're all going to prefer this very polished individual. I was really struck by one of my colleagues afterwards said to me, he said, what do you think of that fellow? And I said, well, he's very impressive. He's got 30 years experience with so-and-so. He said, no, he hasn't. He's got 1 year's experience 30 times. Beautifully summarized, actually. Because I think on AIM companies in particular, you want people who experience life, as much variety, as many interesting situations as possible, because they can contribute based on that. And if you've got someone who's had the same job for 30 years, worked their way up, they might be brilliant. I'm not disparaging them in life, but as a non-executive director, they're only going to be able to contribute a relatively small amount of value and experience. And they're probably going to be very conservative in their outlook, and they're probably going to be uncomfortable with what you have to do in an AIM company.
Really interesting. I was having a conversation with someone who had exactly that profile and trying to explain to them why I thought they would struggle to get a role, because although they were outstanding in this one field, there just wasn't enough to make them stand out against others. You've built a fantastic sort of plural career. You sort of transitioned from your early stage career in PwC into being an exec and board member and a sort of plural board member. And I would guess that sort of variety and that experience across a range of things is what's enabled you to do that, would be my guess. But from your perspective, looking at it, what do you think has enabled you to build a successful plural career? What have been your key lessons on that journey?
Well, I would divide it into two parts. First of all, the glorious time I had with PwC. They were a fabulous outfit to work with. I mean, mainly, I think, looking back on it, because of the people he ended up working with. They were clever. They were big companies, clients. They were interesting scenarios. I mean, you couldn't ask for better as an experience when you're young, to have that kind of opportunity. And so that was tremendous. But also the role that they teach you at PwC is an advisory role. It's a consultative role. And you're sitting in boardrooms, sort of naive, 20 whatever old. You're absorbing all the time. And all of that's useful information for later. I can tell you that now. And then also the second part was when I was doing the gritty bit of actually being an executive in a company. And you accumulate in that quite a lot of experience of what can go wrong and what can go right. I was quite lucky that most of my career ended up being international. So I've also seen lots of comparative cultures. So when I got towards the end of that, I felt that I was kind of, reaching the peak too early, really. And then this NED thing came along, and I thought, wow, this is fabulous, because this is a field where I can bring all that stuff to bear and actually really enjoy myself having fun doing it. And that's exactly what it's been, to be honest, Oliver. It's been the best part of my career by far, because it's been able to draw upon those two sources of strength from the past. I know what it's like to deal with crap in a company and to have it all on your plate to deal with. And I know what it's like to be an advisor to people in big companies about stuff. So if you bring it all together, it means that you can contribute something and feel happy that you're doing it. I don't need to make a point particularly. I just need to remember which bits to bring forward on which occasion. And I very much enjoy doing it. I have to say, it's the most fun I've ever had.
Malcolm, the time has flown by. It's time for me to move on to the 5-question quickfire, where I say a short statement and ask you for a quick response, if that's all right.
Right on, fire away.
So the best book every board member should read, and why?
Well, this is a funny one. I like Eli Goldratt's book called The Goal. It's quite an old book now. It must be about 30 years old. But I like it because it's simple, it's short, it's a story. It's not some tone by some technical guy who wants you to be impressed. It's just a well-written story. And what it tells you about is the Japanese manufacturing techniques, how you run things efficiently and with pace. And what I've learned is useful in boards is that if you can manage the pace, sometimes that's really beneficial to success.
Really interesting. I feel like that's on one of Jeff Bezos's recommendations.
Good.
Favorite quote and why?
My favorite quote is, if you want to launch big ships, go where the water is deep.
Love it. Your best ever holiday and why?
I better say the honeymoon, obviously, but if I were not saying the honeymoon, I would probably say we went as a family when my boys were small. We went to a place in Sicily called Verdura. It was a luxury holiday resort that had just been built by the Forte family. And it was luxury. It was blooming expensive. And I remember going into there thinking, God, this is going to be not very good value. But actually, it was very, very good value because everything's all inclusive. And it was a very high standard. And I've got to say, and we had a lovely time as a family. So I think that was a holiday which I thought would be not that good and turned out to be brilliant.
Your most significant professional insight?
I think listen and think, and then open your mouth.
I like it. Your favorite podcast or app if you don't listen to podcasts?
Well, I wasn't listening to podcasts until I started preparing for this. I have listened to a few of yours, and they're very, very good, as you know. My favourite one is Susanna Nicklin. I worked with her at Baronsmead, and I listened to hers, and I thought that was fabulous. So that's my favourite one.
Oh, brilliant. Delighted to hear. Malcolm, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved speaking with you and learnt massively.
Well, likewise.
Really appreciate you taking the time.
It's been great, Oliver. Thank you very much indeed.